Distinguished participants, good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are tuned in from. It's now my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar titled Powering Agri-food Value Chains with Geothermal Heat. And it's a webinar that is organized by IRENA in collaboration with the International Geothermal Association, IGA, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and it's undertaken in the framework of the Global Geothermal Alliance. My name is Jack Kiruja from the International Renewable Energy Agency, and I'm going to be a moderator for this event. So let me briefly give you an overview of some of the technical aspects of this webinar. So you realize that you are muted by the organizers, but in case you have a question, please type it in the chat function, or you can use the raise hand function during the Q&A. The webinar will also be recorded, and the recordings are going to be made available at the end of the webinar. So this is the agenda for today. And during this event, we are going to listen to several presentations by various speakers who will be making a case for the need to integrate renewable energy, including geothermal, in the agri-food systems. And we're also going to hear about the findings of IRENA's recent report on powering agri-food value chains with geothermal heat, as well as some selected case studies from around the world. Without much ado, now it's my pleasure to welcome the Director for Country Engagement and Partnerships at IRENA, Mr. Goodbus Gonul, to make his opening remarks. Mr. Gonul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jack. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to welcome you to the global webinar on Powering Agri-food Value Chains with Geothermal Heat, which aims to promote sustainable food systems through the application of geothermal energy in the agri-food value chains. And with this webinar, we are very also pleased to launch the new publication with the same name of the seminar, and which is already available on our website. This event is organized within the framework of Global Geothermal Alliance, GGA, which is a multi-stakeholder platform for enhanced dialogue, cooperation, and coordinated action among stakeholders worldwide to foster geothermal development. And at this point, I would like to extend my gratitude to our two partners, FAO and IGA, for their support in organizing the event. Excuse me. As you're all aware, renewable energy and energy efficiency will play a central role in the ongoing global efforts to promote sustainability practices, climate action, and energy transition. The interlinkage between energy and food is the key when discussing major global trends such as growing populations, food security, alleviation of poverty, and addressing climate change. The Energy-Food Nexus aims to address the challenges associated with food security as a result of these global trends by integrating the use of energy in the food value chain, including food production, harvesting, processing, storage, transportation, retail, preparation, and cooking. By mid-century, the demand for food and water is expected to grow by around 50%, putting pressure on existing water, energy, and food systems. However, this increase in demand for food presents an opportunity for clean energy technologies to support the development of sustainable food systems. Whereas food production can be substantially increased by access to energy, clean energy solutions ensure that such increase is achieved in an environmentally friendly manner, and clean energy has the potential to cut down greenhouse gas emissions from the agri-food sector by around 30%. Furthermore, timely processing, drying, and storage of harvested food could be more easily achieved through the application of readily available renewable energy solutions. This can contribute to a significant reduction in food wastage, which stands at around 30% globally and even higher in developing countries. Geothermal energy is uniquely positioned to contribute to the development of sustainable food systems through the utilization of its various streams, such as heat, water, non-condensable gases, mineral elements, and electricity. Between 2015 and 2020, geothermal heating capacity in agri-food and other end-use sectors grew by around 52%. And taking this into account, last year, IRENA, together with IGA, we worked on an energy compact specifically dedicated for raising the heating target for geothermal. We initially set a target with the GGA, with the Global Geothermal Alliance, which was twofold increase in by 2030 compared to 2014, but we raised it to threefold increase. So there's a good momentum already achieved in deploying geothermal heat solutions in agri-food and other end-use sectors, and this is now reflected in the main theme of the main targets of the Global Geothermal Alliance. In the agri-food sector, between 2015 and 2020, geothermal heating capacity in greenhouse increased by 20%, aquaculture heating by 37%, and drying of fruits, vegetables, animal feeds, and cereals by almost 60%. So there is a very significant increase. Industrial applications of geothermal heat in agri-food is yet another area where growth has occurred significantly, with projects in meat processing, bun making, among others, emerging in different parts of the world. In terms of geographical distribution, geothermal usage in agri-food sector has been developed in most regions, and with most projects located in Asia, mainly in China, in Europe and United States. Interest to scale up the deployment of geothermal agri-food applications is growing in other regions, particularly in Central America and East Africa, where there are few demonstration projects already in place and capacity building activities are going on. And also what other benefits such deployment will bring about through the utilization of geothermal heat in the agri-food sector. Obviously, its socioeconomic perspective is extremely important. Numerous job opportunities have been created, many of them for women who are a significant workforce in the agri-food value chains. Local communities living around the geothermal resource areas have also reaped various socioeconomic benefits from the establishment of agri-food businesses, resulting in improved well-being and standards of living. Indeed, these and other benefits are expected to become more widespread as the growth in geothermal agri-food applications is envisaged to accelerate, driven by the increasing focus to develop and utilize low and medium temperature geothermal resources, which are more widely available across the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, if we are to realize the full potential of geothermal heat applications in the agri-food sector, concerted efforts by various stakeholders will be required to address the existing challenges related to inadequate data on geothermal resources and existing heating demand for agri-food applications, absence or misalignment in enabling framework conditions, inadequate financing, and lack of awareness of such good opportunities. IRENA's guidebook for policymakers on powering agri-food value chains with geothermal heat, which was in fact already published last week and available on our website, provides recommendations to accelerate the deployment of geothermal energy in agri-food sector. The recommendations are drawn from best practices identified through an analysis of successful global case studies. And at this point, I would like to extend our gratitude to more than 20 experts from the members and partners of Global Geothermal Alliance and few other organizations who contributed to the development of this guidebook. This global webinar aims to share the findings of this guidebook with stakeholders from the energy, agri-food, and industrial sector, as well as the experiences and best practices from selected case studies. Subsequently, we will organize follow-up capacity building activities in different regions. We will planning one in East Africa, another in Latin America, and we will be organizing them in collaboration with partners who are supporting the deployment of geothermal heat in the agri-food sector. I very much look forward to fruitful discussions and your active participation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gonul, for those encouraging remarks. Now we'd like to go to the next session of this event, where we're going to listen to some keynote presentations from our co-hosts, that is the IGA and the FAO, and they're going to be setting the tone for the event by highlighting the opportunities, the uses, as well as the benefits of using renewables, including geothermal in the agri-food sector. So to begin with, we're going to have Mr. Olivier Dubois, who is going to be making a presentation on leveraging renewable energy in agri-food. Mr. Dubois is a senior natural resources officer, and the leader for the energy program, Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity, and Environment at FAO. So Mr. Dubois, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to kind of give you an overview about the links between energy and agri-food systems. Next slide, please. So why does these links matter so much? It was already alluded to, but let's go through them again and maybe add some things. This slide is basically just to highlight the fact that the links between energy and food are relevant to at least 10 SDGs, and the most relevant ones I think I highlighted as kind of stars on this slide. You know, it's about hunger, obviously, energy, but also water, health, land, water, and sustainable consumption and production, for example, and climate change. Next slide, please. So energy is closely linked to the 4 dimensions of food security. In terms of availability, obviously energy is needed throughout food chains. Access, energy is linked to the price of agriculture inputs, but also to the food prices, but also to farmers' income, and they can provide jobs, so farmers can make money with which they can buy food. Utilization, this is about the quality of food, and obviously you need enough energy to properly cook, and this obviously improves food quality and nutrition, and frees up also cooking time for whoever is cooking at home. Stability, this is about stability in all the above, in more in particular in volatility in energy prices, which can influence food price stability. Next slide, please. To add to that, there's also the huge water, energy, food nexus challenge. Nowadays, as we know, that millions of people still go to bed undernourished. Still, many people lack access to electricity. Still, millions of people lack access to safe drinking and adequate sanitation. And if we continue business as usual, the situation will be even worse by 2030 with the kind of percentages that you can see. And then, you know, the fact that many natural resources are already stressed, and we have the climate change challenge, doesn't make good to this challenge. Next slide, please. Just specifically on climate change, energy is part of the climate change problem in agri-food chain. The energy used in agri-food systems amount to about 30% of GHG emissions from these systems, mainly through the direct CO2 emissions in post-harvest stages, plus fertilizer manufacturing. So these are kind of the blue bits in this pie chart. And this is often overlooked because the GHG from post-harvest stages is accounted for in agro-industry, so industry or energy sectors. Next slide, please. But energy is also part of the solution concerning climate change and agri-food systems. So part of climate action in agri-food systems. Obviously mitigation, if you use renewable energy in food chains, if you, thanks to access to energy, you reduce GHG emissions due to reduced food losses, if you use sustainable bioenergy, and if you use biofuel and bioenergy byproducts as animal feed to reduce needs to grow animal feed, so use land for animal feed, for grains for animal feed. And also through better resource use efficiency in food chains. It also contributes to adaptation, and this is often overlooked because it increases farmer self-sufficiency in sustainable energy and biofertilizer, which are kind of byproducts, let's say from biogas or biochar. It can improve income diversification through the sale of energy and energy jobs. It can also support carbon sequestration through energy tree planting and increase soil carbon through biofertilizer and biochar from biogas. Next slide, please. The basic problem is the current use of energy in agri-food systems is unsustainable. Currently, it represents 30% of global energy, available energy, 30% used beyond the farm gate, and it's very highly dependent on fossil fuels. At the same time, 30% of the food we produce is lost, and together with that, 1/3 of the energy used to produce this lost food. But also the agri-food system is interesting because it can produce energy itself, let's say from residues. Now, you have this first picture, but at the same time, lack of access to sustainable energy for agri-food chain exists in a lot of developing countries, which contribute a lot to food losses, for example, in cold chains. And forest degradation and deforestation from traditional use of wood fuel for household heating and cooking is very frequent in Africa and parts of Asia, let's say Southeast Asia mainly. Next slide, please. So what to do to get the energy food links right? Next slide. Whatever your proposes is to decouple agri-food system development from the use of fossil fuel without compromising food security. And we propose that through our energy food program, which aims at primarily ensuring adequate access to modern energy where needed in food chains, and to do that in 4 ways: through improved energy efficiency, gradually using more renewable energy, sustainable bioenergy, and a water energy food nexus approach in implementing this program. Next slide, please. As part of this program, there's been a very good collaboration with FAO and between FAO and IRENA, and last year we produced a report which was launched at COP26, which has like 8 agenda action points, which are on this slide. And the next slide will kind of illustrate these agenda points, at least some of them. Next slide, please. So what we think is that you need to de-risk and optimize investments in renewable energy for agri-food chains. And the reason why this is not happening is often because there's a lack of robust science-based feasibility assessments. And we propose 3 steps to correct that. One is to really start not from the energy side, but from the food chains side, and look at its status, what are the constraints, the markets, the stakeholders, and is energy a problem? And if yes, where are the entry points to overcome the energy problem? And then you look at, okay, do we have opportunities for renewable energy investments, both from the renewable energy supply side and renewable energy demand side? Once we have kind of mapped out these opportunities and located them, then we go into a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis concerning these investments. Next slide, please. Next. So this is basically the basic analysis that we have to do. Look at what's going on in selected food chain, and you know, what are if is energy an issue, and if yes, what are the entry points for energy, and to correct these issues. Next slide, please. Then the first stage of the second stage or sub-stage is to map the existing demand from energy. What are the opportunities? And this is the work that slide from the work that was done by Powerful in Uganda, where they mapped out where there is a lot of potential to increase maize yields, but it's not being realized because there's lack of processing facilities, because there's lack of energy. So there's no point in producing more maize because you might lose lots of the maize for the lack of processing facility. And so this is where, if you don't have access to energy and there's a big potential to increase the yield, then this is where you should install renewable energy, and in this case, mini-grids. Next slide, please. Together with that, you look at, for example, the best potential for renewable energy supply. And this is a slide about some work we did on the potential to use crop residues to produce bioenergy in Zambia. You can also use from other renewable energies. And when we do that, we take into account about possible competing uses of these residues for soil management, for animal feed, and so on. So what is left, we can use it to produce bioenergy. Next slide. And when we've done these locations for the best locations for these investments in renewable energy, then the complementary analysis is a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis, which is not only about financial aspects, but also environmental, economic, social, and gender. And we did this job concerning solar and biogas in the milk, vegetable, and rice value chains, both at operation and country levels in Tunisia, Kenya, Tanzania, and the Philippines. And it involved investors, IFES, so banks, and governments, and operators. And it ended up with recommendations for all these actors. Next slide. Now, next, yes. As an illustration of this, this is what was done in Kenya for on the left side, solar milk cooler. First, you have all the kind of criteria that we used. Some are quantifiable, and they are in the bar charts, and some are non-quantifiable, quantitative, and they are kind of circles. If you are green, you are fine, you are positive. If you are red, you are negative. If you are orange, you are in between. And you can see that it involves not only financial, but many other aspects. And the example, we have the example of solar milk cooler, but also on solar powered water pumping for vegetables in Kenya. Next slide, please. Now, there's a bit of an issue and a challenge in food chains is the demand is often quite scattered and seasonal. And so we need to address that. And one way to address that within food chains is to combine seasonal demand, so to combine energy for annual crops with more constant demand from meat and milk, but also from perennial crops. And you can also go beyond the food chain. So the same systems that provide energy, supply energy for food, can also be used for other aspects in the local economy. Health, for example, education. So you combine the demand, you aggregate the demand, so you ensure that there's always enough demand for renewable energy. Next slide, please. Some examples of the importance of a water energy food approach. It's some work we did for the government in Rwanda to assess why their national biogas program was not working as well as they thought. And one thing we found is that they had completely overlooked that you need water to produce biogas. For each 1 liter of manure that you use, you need 1 liter of water. And you know, Rwanda is a hilly country. And people need water, obviously, first for them, maybe for their cattle. And if they don't have a water access point nearby, they won't go down and up the hills to get additional water for biogas problems. So access to water in this case was a major impediment to the implementation of a renewable energy program like biogas. Next slide, please. And the other example is an FAO project, a very nice project about how the Nexus can foster circular agri-food systems. And biogas uses sewage water from a refugee camp. Solar energy is used to heat the biogas unit to improve its efficiency. The biofertilizer from biogas is used as compost in local agriculture. And the clean water that results from the cleaning of the sewage water is used for irrigation in fruit tree nurseries. In addition, many refugees are employed in the local biogas plant and the local solid waste treatment unit. So this is a positive example on how important the WEF, the Water Energy Food Nexus, can really improve things at the local level. Next slide, please. Another thing that FAO has been working a lot is what we call integrated food energy systems, which you can achieve by optimizing land use, combining energy crops like trees with food crops like in agroforestry systems, but also through the cascading use of biomass, and typically biogas. And we used kind of a rapid assessment concerning the sustainability, but more interestingly, the replicability of 3 IFES systems in Mozambique and Ghana. And I highlight replicability because this is often not done. And it's important. We had very simple questions to check if these success stories are replicable. Next slide, please. Now, I want to dwell a bit on bioenergy because it's a complicated renewable energy, and therefore it's often overlooked. But be it IRENA, be it the IEA, be it the UN, the IPCC, sorry, they all highlight that we will have to increase a lot the role of bioenergy, in particular biofuels. Next slide, please. Next click. Between now and 2050. And so this is just to highlight that we cannot do without bioenergy, including biofuels. So we need to embrace kind of complexity and move forward for sustainable bioenergy and sustainable biofuels. Next slide, please. And this is highlighted in some of the NDCs that we conducted a study of NDCs in Africa that links to agriculture, and more than 80% mentioned bioenergy, but a lot of them also mention the energy and food links. Next slide, please. So on bioenergy, our key messages from FAO are the sustainability of bioenergy is context specific, and therefore its assessment must be based on reality, not modeling and global studies. These, they can give you a flavor, but definitely it cannot be used to assess sustainability of bioenergy because they oversimplify the picture. Tools and knowledge are now available to help governments and operators reduce the risks and enhance opportunities of bioenergy development. FAO has some, others have other tools. Basically, we know how to get bioenergy right. And per se, bioenergy is neither good nor bad. What matters is really the way it's managed. And bioenergy should be seen as another opportunity for responsible investment in sustainable agriculture, rural development, and bioeconomy. Next slide, please. So summing up, energy food links matter to many SDGs. We know how to get them right. So let's join forces to enhance their sustainable implementation. FAO has the competence and is ready to play a leading role in moving this agenda forward. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Dubois, for that wonderful presentation. We note that you highlighted that energy is a key component of the agri-food sector, and that it's not just energy, but we need to have renewable energy so that we can use it as a catalyst for climate change mitigation as well as for adaptation. So we're now going to go to the next presentation where we are going to look specifically at geothermal energy in the agri-food sector. And this presentation is going to be delivered by Ms. Andy Blair. And Ms. Andy Blair is the president for the International Geothermal Association, as well as the co-founder for the Upflow, a geothermal consultancy, research and innovation company based in New Zealand. So Ms. Andy Blair, welcome.
Kia ora, thank you, Jack. So, inga mana, inga iwi, ka huri ngā mihi kia koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So it's my privilege to speak to you all today about something I'm really passionate about, geothermal energy. So there is potentially 1 terawatt worth of energy still to be realized, of geothermal energy still to be realized, and that's significantly greater than the approximately 1.6 gigawatts that's installed right now. And when we in the geothermal industry hear 1 terawatt of geothermal, we don't think about the number, the size of the investment that requires, or how that compares to others. We automatically think about how the world would look. And I think this is a significant contributor to the reason why that people that work in the geothermal industry are so passionate about it, because that's the world that we all deserve and the one we want to leave to those coming behind us. In New Zealand, Māori, our Indigenous people, say that the health of people is determined by the health and well-being of the land and water. And in a 1 terawatt geothermal world, the people and the land and the environment are thriving. What we know in the geothermal industry that many don't, it's a secret, is that utilizing geothermal resources means more than electricity. It means more, it's more than a simple substitute for other generation types. It's an electricity plus business case. And what do I mean by that? Not only is it the only generation type that can provide baseload power independent of atmospheric conditions, but post-electricity generation, there is significant value in the remaining heat and constituents of the geothermal fluid. So not only can you generate revenue from the electricity market, you can also create other diverse sources of revenue. And we call this cascade use. And why it's an electricity plus business case? You can do all of these at the same time. And we're standing on it right now, right? It's Earth's energy and it's boundless. So if you take a moment and think, how would you do things differently if you had endless energy? And why is geothermal the friend of food? Well, if you look at this graph here, this describes all the kind of activity that you can perform and the temperatures that you can relate that you need to perform these activities and what geothermal can offer. A couple of things that geothermal can do is it can provide heating and cooling for industrial processing. So there's a fish processing facility in Iceland where they take the fish and they remove the fillets. And then they take the spines and the heads of the fish and dry them using geothermal heat and send them as a source of protein to Nigeria. They then use this fish skin for skin grafts, for medical skin grafts. They take the gut oils for nutraceuticals, and they have this holistic use of geothermal and fish, and it's a really compelling business case. I don't know if you know a lot about New Zealand. We're a small country at the bottom of the planet in the South Pacific, but we have lots of these things hanging around, and these are particularly healthy looking ones. And in New Zealand, we use geothermal energy to help us process products from the dairy industry. And this project here is miraka. Now, miraka is the Māori word for milk. And this project, we are using geothermal heat to dry milk to create milk powder and long life milk products to export overseas. From an economic perspective, within 1 year of operation, Miraka was financially viable. So geothermal offers economic and green reasons to food processing. And I think a key thing here to recognize that we in the geothermal industry recognize is geothermal in itself is not the goal. People don't actually care about geothermal. And when I say that, it freaks people out because I am the president of the global organization. What people really care about is that they can plug into sustainable green energy, and it's from ethical place. And so when we talk about geothermal, we're talking about what it can catalyze in the world. And this Miraka at the bottom left of that diagram is just one component of this integrated use of resources that happens in this location. So geothermal and all the aspects of geothermal are considered in integrated resource use. And we can see examples of this in Iceland and their resource parks and all sorts of things. But here we can see the geothermal power station powering Miraka, the waste material going to the worm farms that are then used, they're commercial worm farms, those exist, that are used in planting for native forestry. The heat and products, worm stuff is used in glass houses where tomatoes are grown. And also recently, a hydrogen project has joined this cluster in New Zealand. And this is what it looks like put together, and it looks pretty green. Another really interesting example is in geothermal environments, they're really unusual environments, and they provide other offerings, not just hot water for electricity and heat, but they provide other offerings such as microorganisms that live in these environments. We call them extremophiles. And in New Zealand, well, they're microbes that live in extreme environments, extremophiles. And in New Zealand, we are doing a project where we're looking at using microbes from geothermal environments that will eat CO2 and methane and create single cell protein food stocks for some of our food, our dairy and other fish type stocks. And we're working on that project right now. The technology has been proven, and now we're looking at whether it's commercially viable. So therefore, geothermal is an electricity plus opportunity for investors, and it's not just in an economic sense. It can offer solutions to some of the world's most pressing problems. So access to water. So you can access more water through geothermal energy production from wells and condensate, and you can use geothermal energy for desalination processes. This image here is from a project in El Salvador where steam condensate from the geothermal power station is used to water cacao and coffee commercial plantations. And they hire over 600 women, local women, to work in this project. Food security. So this is a topic we're obviously talking about right now. Through heating and cooling from geothermal energy that's efficient and low cost, we can create environments suitable for food production that don't exist naturally. And also we can create new opportunities closer to demand markets. There are many examples of these projects around the world, tomato, capsicum, and other food growing operations. Geothermal energy can also support greater decarbonisation efforts. And what we mean is not just low emissions generation of electricity, but geothermal applications in food production and post-harvest processes. And I know we're going to hear a bit about a few examples after this session. And these processes, all of these things can contribute to the adaptation of food systems to the climate change issue. A really important element of this is employment. So geothermal systems are often located in rural, poor, and isolated locations where small communities exist. Here is a small table, and this is, I think this table's in the report, but we'll talk to it. There's a lot of information. If you just look to the right and you see in the column FTE, that means full-time equivalent, that talks to how many people are employed in each of these industrial direct use projects in New Zealand. And on average, it requires about 100 full-time equivalents per project. So they are big employers of people. And all of these projects are located in rural locations in New Zealand, and they have high Māori population or our Indigenous peoples populations. So there's a triple impact there. And just speaking about Indigenous prosperity, we've seen projects around the world in geothermal where geothermal increases the prosperity of these communities, Indigenous peoples and local communities, and seen huge transformation due to the development of projects. One group I'm working with here in New Zealand has gone from a small land trust, which is basically a group of a few thousand family members that have land that sits above geothermal reservoirs, a few tens of thousands in their bank account, to within 15 years, they've become a company with over $500 million in assets. And that includes owning geothermal power stations. They are not only a strong commercial entity, but they also reinvest millions every year in the well-being of their people through educational, housing, medical, cultural, and sporting grants. So we need more people writing business cases, understanding what the true investment and return calculation looks like. Geothermal projects are not just energy projects, they are economic development projects, they're food security projects, they're Indigenous peoples projects, and they're climate and environmental projects. And we make electricity too. So to realize this 1 terawatt geothermal future, we have to engage with influential global groups broader than ourselves, our geothermal sector and community. We need those governments, corporations, investors and leaders to know what a geothermal future can offer economically and to wider society. To achieve our climate goals, we can't just do more of the same. That was made loud and clear at COP last year. We need to break existing frameworks and do things differently. Similar to the digital transformation, we need to exponentially move, and we need to create bold and ambitious plans and act now. We can't wait for perfection. We need to do our best and keep iterating, and we need to be good partners with everybody. This is an all of government, all of economy effort that must be resourced effectively to meet the magnitude of the collective change ahead. Good intentions, whilst nice, are not enough to bring around change. It requires sustained investment, appropriate incentives, and evidence-based interventions. And we need all leaders from all sectors of society to demand more. Luckily, geothermal can offer solutions, and it's economically competitive right now. So we all need to raise our voices so that more people see the opportunity that exists in this space. So thank you to IRENA, the GGA, and all of our partners working in this space, because choosing to invest in these projects mean that we will have a greater positive impact on the world. And that 1 terawatt geothermal world is the one we want all of our children to live in. And finally, just want to leave you with this note. In New Zealand, there is a saying, we call it a whakatauki, and it's from Māori that says, hei kai kei aku ringa, means that there are food at the end of my hands, and that people should use their abilities and the resources around them to create success for themselves and their future generations. So, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you, everybody.
So thank you very much, Andy, for that wonderful presentation. So now we're going to the next session of this event, where we are going to be listening to our distinguished speakers talking about guidelines for using geothermal in the agri-food sector. And in this session, we're also going to listen to some very interesting case studies from around the world. So the principal speaker for this session will be Mr. Hezi Ram, and he's going to be sharing the findings of the guidebook for policymakers, which was developed by IRENA, which is titled Powering Agri-food Value Chains with Geothermal Heat. And I think this was also mentioned by my director, Gulbus, during his opening remarks. So Mr. Hezi Ram is a senior geothermal consultant at Greenmax Capital, and he was the team leader for the team that supported IRENA to develop this guidebook. He has many years of experience in the geothermal industry as a developer of geothermal power plants in North and Central America, and as well worked as a consultant for capacity building on geothermal in East Africa. So Mr. Ram is going to be making 3 separate presentations covering the key themes of the guidebook, and in between his presentations, we are going to hear the case studies from our other distinguished speakers. That's Mr. Hans Bolscher, Ms. Ellen Grimsdottir, and Mr. Eduardo Perez. So Mr. Hezi Ram, the floor is yours to go on to the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jack, and thanks, Arena, and everybody else who is joining our interesting webinar. I'm going to present 3 presentations that were prepared by Greenmax, as Jack suggested. 2 of the presentations, including the first one, were really prepared by my colleague Anna Colvin, so she deserves the credit for that. Unfortunately, because of the timing issue, she is in Chile, she could not make the presentation herself, so I'm doing it on her behalf. The first presentation is going to talk about how do we match the resource, the mapping of the resource with the demand, which is presented in the agri-food markets, in order to optimize the investment of the geothermal to support direct use in the agri-food value chain. Next slide, Alex. So we're looking basically 2 options, two venues. One is the resource mapping, and the other one is the heat demand mapping. On the resource mapping, the key challenge facing the geothermal industry is that most geothermal resources suitable for direct use are largely unexplored, as we know. Resources in the low medium temperature range are not as constrained geographically compared to conventional high temperature resources, which are used mainly for power generation. And it is often the case that inadequate data are available for these resources, which cannot justify the drilling of geothermal wells. However, in many instances, these resources may be located closer to agriculturally productive areas, which is good news. In addition, these resources may occur at shallow depth and hence can be developed more easily and at a lower cost than deeper geothermal resources, which are usually developed for power generation. The first step in identifying where geothermal energy solutions could add value to agri-food value chain is mapping out the geothermal resources. This will include initial desktop feasibility study of geoscience information, followed by collecting data in the field. For example, geochemistry, geology, geophysics, all the tools that we know that are used in the geothermal industry. It is important to estimate the resource temperature and the date early on. The temperature available from the geothermal resource will influence to a large extent the choice of the direct use application to be developed. There are some higher temperature applications we saw in the slide from New Zealand and some low temperature application. The resource depth will influence the project development, the project economics, as resources at shallow depth can be developed, as we said before, cheaper. The direct use project may be integrated in an existing geothermal plant development, what we call cascading, which we'll discuss a bit later, by using the injectee brine or the injection brine, the brine used for reinjection, to lower the cost and the risk. or the project can stand alone. I'll talk about those different business models in the next slide. In parallel, and that's the other part of the slide, market studies should be carried out to identify and map out existing agri-food applications and potential markets near geothermal resources areas. Assessment for direct use projects should also ensure that there is sufficient demand for the energy, considering that the energy, which is really heat, should be used in the vicinity of the resource area. Integrated geothermal direct use technology into agri-food value chains require geographically aligning the agri-food market or industrial application with the geothermal resource. GIS platforms can be used to integrate the resource mapping with the demand mapping in order to identify any co-location between geothermal energy resources and demand. In many countries, online interactive GIS web portals exist to facilitate this analysis, which I will discuss later in this presentation. Next one, please. We have actually, we do have two approaches how to get to the answer, which is where the resource and where it makes sense, the geothermal resource, and where it makes sense to develop it. One approach is what we call the resource push, which basically whereby we optimize by engineering the application. What you want to do there is to perform a local technical assessment of the geothermal resource at the site of an existing agri-food facility, and an engineering assessment of the facility itself to evaluate its heat or power requirements. In other words, we have a plant which is already operating, let's say being fed by diesel fuel or wood fire, and we want to see if we can replace it with the geothermal energy. Unless the facility is located near a known geothermal resource, the most suitable technologies are often lower temperature direct use application, less than 60 degrees Celsius, being supplied with energy from shallow hydrothermal wells, which could integrate heat pumps as well. Low temperature application include aquaculture, geothermal greenhouses, soil warming, irrigation, and mushroom food culturing. This type of agriculture application are more prevalent worldwide because of their low geothermal resource temperature requirements. The other approach, what we call the opportunistic use of the resource, we look at the resource and we perform a regional technical assessment to identify the most favorable sites to produce geothermal energy and attract industries to relocate there. This could also entail carrying out an assessment of the potential geothermal agri-food application around an area with known geothermal potential. Now we explain how we do the mapping in the next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, we do have today access to digital geothermal maps in many places in the world. And as you can see, there are quite a few entities that offer these facilities. And that should be done as the initial step. We develop the digital data portals, online databases, interactive GIS maps, analytical tools that can help us to identify those potential areas with geothermal resources which are suitable for direct use. And as you can see, many countries have developed these types of tools to support initial identification of sites with techno-economic potential for direct use application. The interactive maps and analytical tools facilitate geothermal direct use resource assessment for potential investors in the regional, national, and local levels. Please remember that these platforms do not replace in-depth technical feasibility studies we will talk about later. They just provide initial overview of the geothermal potential for a given location or region. Local digital portals are useful to policymakers to raise awareness of geothermal solutions, promote accelerated geothermal development, and encourage development of new areas. And as you can see here, we have those facilities available in Europe, in Africa, Canada, the US, and South America. Next, please. Here's an example of New Zealand. And if you have an opportunity to look later on in these slides in more than one, in more details, you can see that there are certain criteria on the keynote in the key of the map that talks about what kind of findings you can see, geothermal resources, and what kind of applications that can come along. I think we can move to the next one, Alex. And this is the recommendation part. And what we recommend here is that several measures can be taken to address the challenge of mapping out geothermal resources in agri-food markets. We should perform technical pre-feasibility studies, including the on-site data collections. Nothing replaces the work on site. Utilize mapping tools such as digital data portals, online databases, interactive GIS maps to support resource identification, as we said, as the first stage. Consider ways to reduce cost and risk, such as development of shallow resources or related to electricity generation. Non-geothermal resources area is key to go this way. And to identify, as I said, co-located geothermal resource and agri-food applications through engineering optimization or opportunistic use of the geothermal resource. That sums up this presentation. I'll see you in a few minutes with the other presentation. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Hezi, for that wonderful presentation. You've highlighted that it's not only important to know where the geothermal resources are, but it's important to have them included in maps, and also trying to show the correlation between where the geothermal resources are and where the heat, the demand for that geothermal heat is located. So thank you very much. So now we go to the next presentation. And this is going to be a quite interesting presentation. It's going to be delivered by Mr. Hans Bolscher. And it's about the geothermal use in the Netherlands. So this is a country that has traditionally been an oil and gas country, but now they're moving away from the use of fossil fuels to the use of renewables such as geothermal, including in the agri-food sector. So Mr. Bolscher is a senior consultant for energy, climate and sustainability, and is also the chairperson of the Dutch Geothermal Association in the Netherlands. So Mr. Bolscher, the floor is yours.
I think everybody can hear me now and you can see my slides. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for some others. It's my pleasure to present the situation of the geothermal heat in the Netherlands, and especially then in relation to the food production in the Netherlands. Next slide, please. I'm the chair of an association with quite some members, and we see members both in the agricultural sector, the greenhouses and all the partners around the greenhouses in the Netherlands, but also more and more in the built environment. So the heat companies supplying district heating. I'll tell a bit more about that later. Next slide, please. But first, what is happening at this moment on geothermal energy in the Netherlands? It is really starting to kick off. It's not huge. We have at 24 locations, some 31 operational doublets. And so it's getting there. We're getting bigger, but the potential is a lot bigger. I have to say it is not easy. In the Netherlands, the situation in the subsoil is not ideal. We don't have very easy, accessible, high heat. We have to dig like 3 kilometers, 3.5 kilometers to bring up heat of about 80 to 100 degrees. That is good for heating greenhouses. That is not good enough for producing electricity. So we only use geothermal heat to bring up heat for the greenhouses. Next slide, please. And that's really also where it started, with the greenhouses. The Dutch greenhouses, well, we think, I don't know whether that's true, but we think they're pretty famous. They're very efficient food producing industries. It's high tech. It's capital intensive. It's very technological, and it's driven by cheap fuel. The reason why we have so much is because we had cheap fossil gas, and it's not easy to compete with something that is so cheap. So only now, when it's getting more expensive, and when we realize we can't continue with cheap gas, we are looking more at the alternatives. But we have all these greenhouses, and they need heat. So that's why the greenhouse sector themselves started with the first geothermal project, really as pioneers in 2012. Currently, we have 20 major greenhouse locations with geothermal energy. And when I see major, at some of these locations, 2,000–3,000 people are working. And these are investments of each geothermal project in such a greenhouse is an investment of $10 to $20 million. It's pretty intensive. Next slide, please. So what is the policy context in the Netherlands? We have quite a lot of different things pulling and pushing at this moment. The first is, and the most important driver is the climate. And the agro industry is using the cheapest resources available, and that always was gas and oil. So it's only because we have a big climate problem that they are moving away from that. And we have what we call a climate agreement between industry, politics, and the society. And in that climate agreement, we said we need 35 new projects. This was a few years ago. Wasn't that ambitious? We want more. Recently, there's a new government with a more active climate policy, and they said the whole agri sector must be climate neutral by 2040. Well, that's quite a challenge. The greenhouses in the Netherlands consume more than 5% of all our energy. So getting that climate neutral is a challenge, but we have to. And that's a pretty massive reduction, 4.5 megatons, which is roughly 5% of all the reduction we have to do up to 2030 in the Netherlands. But currently there's something else going on, and that's really very impactful. That is that the Dutch stopped pumping up their own gas. We have plenty in the north of the Netherlands, but because of social unrest and some soil movements, for safety reasons, society has said we have to stop. So we stopped the whole gas production in the north, and we're now depending from imports. And currently gas prices are going through the roof. So with these current gas prices, people are very uncertain what the cost of this high-tech energy intensive production in the greenhouses will be in the future. So the sector came up with a document, how they look now at the future. And for them, they see geothermal as their saving. That could be their way out of this crisis. So both climate and the gas crisis are pointing in the direction of much more geothermal in the Netherlands. Next slide, please. It doesn't come easy. That's what I said already. It's expensive, as simple as that. And no, it's not too expensive. The alternative is too cheap. The polluting alternative of burning gas is still too cheap. So we have to do something about that. We need a better subsidy system. We are blessed with, we are living in a rich country and we get a lot of subsidies, which is good. But the way the subsidies are given and the amounts are not suited for the projects we need, because there is a lot of insecurity in geothermal, much more than in building a field of solar panels or wind turbines. That is a much more predictable business case. So the subsidy system must be a little bit more tuned to that. And there is currently something very counterintuitive going on. Gas price is high. So you would say, well, you're in a better competing position. True. But the subsidy system is based on that gas price. So with a high gas price, people don't get any subsidies for the ongoing projects. So that's not very motivating for starting new projects. So that is one problem. And the second problem is the price of CO2. Overall, it's very good that the price of CO2 is getting higher and higher. That's a big incentive of reducing carbon in industry. However, the greenhouses, they use CO2, they buy CO2 as a fertilizer. They increase the CO2 tension in the greenhouses, and therefore they produce the food more efficiently. There is more food coming out of a square meter because of that. But CO2 is getting much more expensive for them. So the whole weighing all the cost and benefits, it's really a problem for the greenhouse, for the greenhouses at this moment. So financially, it's not a fully sound picture yet. We're working to that. Secondly, societal. I already spoke that there was a lot of unrest in the north because of the gas and some minor earthquakes. This unrest has translated all through the society, and everything we're doing under the ground is looked up at very, very skeptical. So we have to prove that we're not 100% safe, but even more. And we always say zero risk doesn't exist, but we have a problem in the societal acceptance because they don't want any risks. So that is also something that we are struggling with. We didn't have any problems, but we don't want to get into any problems either. Last but not least, there are technical challenges. And we really have to understand the underground better to know where we have really good opportunities. The Dutch underground is with seismic scans being scanned for the last decades because of all our gas production. But for geothermal, you need other knowledge, and we have to do that again. So we're running currently a nationwide geothermal underground scanning program. We really have to understand where it's possible, how high is the production. We need more efficient EPSs. That's the pumps that bring up the heat, because they work on electricity and that cost money. So the more efficient the EPS, the lower the cost and the lower the footprint of the geothermal pump. We have to organize the drilling better. If we want to drill more than 50 geothermal units a year, we have to organize the drilling in a systematic way. Otherwise, we don't have enough drills, we don't have enough capacity, we don't have enough excellent people to man that. And last but not least, a very important challenge is underground heat storage. We want to use the underground for heat storage so that we can, part of the oversupply we have in the summer, that we can use that in the winter with a heat balancing system under the ground. Those are our main technical challenges. Next slide, please. But there are also opportunities. And one of the things we see as the biggest opportunity is the combination between heating greenhouses and district heating in the adjacent communities. That creates support, that creates solutions for making the houses climate neutral. And that is something that is really very helpful for our projects. Another opportunity is a bit, let's call it, coming from a negative side, is that the sector, the greenhouse sector, is under such stress in the current crisis that government and the sector have to come up with new approaches. We can't continue the way they're working. And one of the new approaches away from the cheap gas is geothermal. So there's a lot happening because of that crisis. And we take this crisis as a positive opportunity for geothermal. Next slide, please. I'm coming to the end of my presentation. For producing food as efficient as we do in the greenhouses in the Netherlands, you need a lot of energy. A lot of energy, and geothermal will be a key supplier of that energy. Not the only one, but we expect in the greenhouse sector, it will be 50% or more geothermal in the future. Second, a really good opportunity is to combine the food in the greenhouses with the houses where the people live around. That gives societal support, that makes the projects more viable, and that is a very good combination of possibilities. But we're not there yet. We need to bring costs down. We need to understand better what's where and how we can best do it in the subsoil. We recently had a very promising project that didn't deliver enough heat because of problems in the subsoil. It's not a given everywhere, every moment that you drill in the ground and you hit the heat in the way you want it. So it's also about together developing more knowledge in order to deliver. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Mr. Bolsha, for that wonderful presentation. We note that the government of the Netherlands has the objective of getting to carbon neutrality by 2040, and also that the geothermal has been identified as a fuel for the future for the Netherlands. And of course, for this to happen, you've also mentioned a number of incentives that have been put in place. But it's also clear that the fact that incentives are there, it's not obvious that they're going to translate into projects because there are also other dynamics that come into play. Finally, I think you've also mentioned on the need to have a bit of coordination among policies from different sectors, for example, greenhouses and agri-food, in order to be able to support the geothermal development. So thank you very much for that. And our next presenter, I'm going again to invite Mr. Hezi Ram to also now speak about the enabling frameworks, some of which have already been mentioned by Mr. Bolsha, and also the need to have better coordination among the policies across different sectors. So Hezi, over to you.
Thank you, Jack, again. And I'm going to talk about the non-technical aspects of developing those facilities or direct use application in the agri-food industry. Generally speaking, we do have two elements to every project. We have the geothermal resource, and then we have the processing plant. And I'm going to talk about how we combine them together to get a good result, which means a profitable operation. The first issue is the issue of policies and the regulation. The things that the previous speaker talked about, the policies of the government of Holland. Generally speaking, the renewable energy, out of all the renewable energy technologies, geothermal really requires much more government intervention. The reason for that, as was mentioned before, is because we operate not only above the ground with those processing plants, but we also operate underground. And there are different regulation, different policies. In many countries of the world, the government owns the land, And in even larger number of the countries in the world, the government has all the mineral rights. Geothermal is considered sometimes mineral rights, sometimes considered water. There's a lot of way here to get confused. So it's not surprising that out of all the renewable energy technology, geothermal requires the most policy and regulation attention. The policy is important because we want to know that the industry is welcome to the country, so to speak, and how does the government, which sets up the policies, can show it. The government can provide special benefits like subsidies, like they do in Holland, in other countries. The government can provide tax benefits like they do in the US, where they don't like direct subsidies, but they like to do it differently. And the government also can remove all kinds of barriers to the industry. So the developers are welcome to come and develop. But then we need the details, as we said, God is in details. We need detailed regulations. We need to know, to understand how we apply for a concession. Is it a competitive or non-competitive process? Do we get a concession for exploration only, or can we get a concession for exploration and then for exploitation? And that's quite sophisticated or quite complicated area. Can be quite complicated in many areas, in many countries. Similarly to geothermal concessions for power generations, but not completely similar. And then we need a roadmap to know how we can get the permit and the license so we can develop a project that is not harm the environment and is in full compliance with the community. And we need also the ability to access surface rights, what we call easement, etc. If we need to run some pipelines or power lines, how to do it and what to do it, and of course, how we're dealing with the community. It's clear that especially just those kind of projects in the agri-food sector cannot be developed successfully unless you have the full support of the community. The community has to be behind you 100%, otherwise don't even try to start. Next one, please. Here's a roadmap to develop a project. Again, I'm not talking about the technical aspect that much as we talked before. I'm talking mostly about the business aspect. How do we get to a project? How do we get from A to Z to a successful project in the directives application in the agri-food? First of all, we have to do the studies, as we discussed before, to map it, to identify what the market is, to look at what's available and what's not available. Then we have to look at the geothermal resource and tailor the technology to it. Some geothermal resources, as we said before, requires high temperature if you want to dry milk and so on. And some resources require, some technology require low temperature if you want to dry some vegetable or fruit. So you have to tie the technology to the quality of the resource. And remember, when we talk about the resource, let's not forget one thing. We're looking at the key sustainable resource. Those projects, which as indicated are very expensive upfront, the only way that they can pay off the investment is by operating for many years. And we're looking at projects that are doing 20, 30 years. Some of the projects I developed 35 years ago are still up and running. Power generation, but the example is clear. So you need to develop the resource in a way that it will continue to supply the heat in terms of temperature and flow rate for 20 or 30 years. So don't try to cut it short. You have to do it on a sustainable basis. Then once you know where you are, potentially you have to bring in all the stakeholders. This will include, of course, the community, as I mentioned before, the developer, the people who want to use the facility, the people who buy the product from the facility, and of course, the regulators that need to provide the permit and the license to this project. So best is to engage everybody in the process early on to identify any roadblocks or red flags and deal with them as quickly as possible. And then once you have the players in place, once you understand the technical parameters of the project, you have to do a business plan. A business plan means that you have to look at the cost, the potential capital cost, the potential operating cost, the potential financing cost. And you have to look to see if you have the local people that you need to work in the project, or you need to bring them from outside, etc., etc. And you come with a business plan, and this business plan will be the basic for your financing. Because most projects require financing, for outside. And we're going to talk about in the next slide, what are the sources of funding or financing for those projects. So here, the good news is that, especially for developing countries, we do have a lot of options to get financing for this kind of projects. We have many institutions like the World Bank, like the IFC, the IDB, African Development Bank, and also all the multilaterals, FMO, Proparco, etc., just to pick a few names, who are anxious to invest or to lend money to projects in developing countries like Africa, Central America, South America, and so on, which are engaged in renewable energy development, climate change, etc. And if you had the benefit of food security, you know, they are even much more interested to do so. So there are plenty of listeners, and you have to tailor your product in terms of the financing requirements to what they need. I won't go through the whole list of the available financing elements that you can see on the slide. You can look at it later. But it goes from pure grants, which is the top of the list, meaning that you get the money and you use it, you know, to develop the project. And if the project is successful, everybody is happy. If the project is not successful, everybody loses, but you have no obligation to return any money. Those grants usually are available at the first stage of the project, whereby you have to engage in the drilling. And as we heard before, drilling can be quite expensive, and it's clearly very risky because not every well that you drill will perform according to the planning. You can do all the geophysics, the geology, the geochemistry, reservoir engineering. You can do all those. You can engage in all those technology techniques. And when you drill the well, you drill and look to try to pump it or to flow it. Things don't work always as expected, and usually they don't work better. They work worse. So for this stage, which is a big barrier to any developer, you have those kind of grants or contingent grants or even risk mitigation tools which are not available in any other renewable energy technology, which can come in the form of participating cost sharing like GRMF in Africa, East Africa, or could be insurance. You can buy insurance that the drilling of the well was, if the drilling of the well was done properly, you can get insurance company to pay if eventually the resource was not successful. And that goes all the way to the final way of financing, which is the project financing. Project financing is done like in any other infrastructure project financing, whereby you pledge the asset of the project and you get debt from all kind of lending institution. And it's quite complicated, but it's eventually what you need to do once you have the facility to build and operate. In the next slide, we're going to talk about the different ownership, which leads to business model. And here what we have is an interesting situation. I mean, we can have ownership in various ways of the facility. Remember, as I said before, we have two major elements. We have the geothermal resource, which would be one well, couple of wells, production and injection, because you have to return back the resource. And you have the facility, the processing facility, whereby you are drying fish or vegetables or heating something or whatever the case is. And those two things have to work in harmony and synchronized. And one without the other is not good. Only both of them can work together to produce what you need. In most time, we have one owner for the whole facility. We have somebody, an entity, that has access to the geothermal resource or drill the geothermal resource, and now is building the plant, the processing plant. So there's one single ownership, and there's no issue of what we call transfer price whereby the heat is moving from the geothermal resource to the processing plant. Then we have another model where we have a power plant, and I think the lady from New Zealand mentioned that, whereby you take the injectee before it goes into the injection wells, and you run it through a processing plant, stripping additional heat. And then you may be in a situation whereby the ownership of the power plant is not, the owner of the power plant is not interested to engage in direct use applications, but is willing to sell the heat that comes from the power plant. So you have two separate ownership, one of the resource and one of the power of the processing plant. Then you have to find a mechanism how the person who provides you the heat can be compensated, whereby you want to make sure that you don't pay so much for the heat as the owner of the processing plant that you won't be able to sell your product profitably. And then you have also the model of integrated geothermal direct use and electricity generation, similar to what we call in the industry CHP, combined heat and power, whereby you produce both heat and electricity, and you can modulate between the two. So the business model, as I said, the simplest model is when you have just one owner, but life is usually not that simple. So sometimes you have two owners, and the owner of the resource can be either an owner for geothermal field, whereby he sells you the heat coming straight from the field, or it can be from a cascading operation where you have a power plant selling you the injectee, the right to use the injectee for your processing facility. Now, some people will come and say, you know, if it's an injectee that goes anyway into the ground, why should the power plant owner should be compensated? Because anyway, he's going to get rid of the injectee, will go to the ground. This way it goes to a processing plant, then it goes to the ground. A fair point, but not completely accurate, because when I inject water back into the ground at a relatively high temperature, that means that the heating period for this injectee pulled water to go back to be heated through the rocks and to be able to, so I can use it back into the power generation. If I do it at high temperature, the heating time will be shorter. But if I strip additional heat and bring in the resource back into the resource, the injectee in the resource at a low temperature, that means that I will have to wait longer until the heating of the injectee will take place and will have the ability to produce it. Which means that from the power generator, the power generation ownership or the owner, he may be looking at a longer period or degradation of the resource quicker than he expected. And he has to be compensated for that. So that's why you have to pay for that. And the mechanism we're using for that is what we call HPA, which is analogous to PPA, heat power agreement compared to power purchase agreement, whereby you pay for the heat based on energy, units of energy, or based on unit of energy, kilowatt hour BTU per minute, or you use it, you convert it into amount of water, so much dollars, so many cents for a cubic meter of water. And how we calculate the HPA, shall we move on? This is a, you know, it's a nascent industry just in early stage, so we don't have that many examples how it works. To be honest with you, I think those models will be developed, but then eventually we identified two potential models for the HPA approach. One is the cost-based approach, and the other one is the market-based approach. Each one of them has different parameters. Each one of them has the benefits and the disadvantages, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So what is the cost-based approach, a cost-plus approach? The cost-plus approach is a very simple approach whereby we say, okay, I'm developing the geothermal resource and I want to sell the resource, I want to sell the product to a processing plant that's going to use the resource for heating, drying, whatever the case is. So what I'm doing, what I know is it's going to cost me, I have to put down the capital cost, which is the drilling of the resource, confirmation, etc., but basically the drilling and some piping, delivery system. So that's the capital cost, what we call the CapEx. And then after the project is up and running, I have to take into account the operating cost. Our Dutch friend mentioned EPS, which are pumps. The pumps, electrical pumps, we are using submersible pumps in this case, but doesn't matter, could be other pumps. So there's a cost of operating those pumps, electricity, maintenance, etc. Also, I need people, etc. And so I have operating costs associated with this operation every year. Whereby the capital cost is one-time investment, mostly, assuming you don't have to do any major innovations, then the operating costs go with you every year, and the operating costs should include also financing costs, because if you go to the bank to borrow some money, you have to pay it back, and that is part of the deal. So you calculate what is the capital cost and what is the operating cost by discounting the operating cost back to what we call the present value, and you have a number you allocate it by the amount of the kilowatt hours that you can produce based on temperature, flow rate. I will go into all the details, and you present this number to the processing plant, which should also reflect some profit, 10%, 15%, 12%, whatever the number. And then if he's willing to pay for that, then you go through the sole operation. If the processing plant is willing to pay for that, you go to the process, to the operation. Maybe it's 2 cents per kilowatt hour, maybe it's 3 cents per kilowatt hour, but the other guy has to look at it and say, okay, if I buy this energy at this price, will I be able to sell my dry fish and still make a profit? The second approach is more opportunistic, and it's what I call the market-based approach. I go to a facility which, let's say, it's operating already, drying fish, drying vegetables, drying fruits, drying milk. And this facility is using a boiler, which is fed by diesel fuel, let's say. I can calculate what is the cost of, what does it cost the owner to burn this diesel fuel. And fortunately or unfortunately, today diesel fuel is very expensive. I'm not sure how cheap it's going to get down the road. So I say, okay, it costs you 4, 5, 6 cents per kilowatt hour to create the energy, the thermal energy that you need for your operation. I'm going to provide you the geothermal heat. You just pay me the same amount for the same level of energy. And not only you don't waste more money, but you're going to do good to the environment, the climate. Everybody is going to like you because you're not polluting the environment anymore. So this approach could be very profitable, especially in times of high energy prices, fossil fuel. The problem is that, of course, that what goes up can go down, and if your price that you sell the energy from the resource based tied to the gas prices, and so to oil prices or whatever other index which is tied to fossil fuel, you take the risk it's going to be fluctuating, and lending institutions would rather go with the first approach, whereby you know how much you're going to get for the next 20 years or so from the processing plant, then go with the market-based approach, which could be speculative in nature. So those two models are available today. They will be developed. There might be other models. We'll watch how the industry is moving. And the last slide is the recommendation. Again, a lot of text on the slide, but I would like to emphasize that the policy is very important. We need to have a transparent, clean, simple policy so people can understand what they need to do in order to be able to get those projects off the ground, and what is the government and the regulators are committed to in terms of producing the permits, the licenses within a certain period of time, so they cannot drag their feet for too long a time. And we need to work on the access to financing to make sure the financing is easier to obtain by getting all kind of support mechanism in order to make those projects viable. Not all the last word is regarding the financing. We looked at a lot of potential project in the agri-food. Not all of them will be able to stand on their feet today. Very much like the Dutch project that was mentioned before. We'll talk about the heat, the greenhouses. So it's clear that this industry will require small support before it can stand on its feet, and it deserves it. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much, Hezi, for that wonderful presentation. Again, you've highlighted the need for policies as well as regulations, and also very important to have the national roadmaps for geothermal heating, which tend to bring together all the different elements that are needed for the projects to take off. You've also mentioned a couple of enablers, including financing, the ownership models, business models, as well as the development of geothermal heat tariffs that can support the development of geothermal agri-food projects. So thank you very much for that. Now we'd like to go to the next presentation, where we are going to hear of a case study of a geothermal project for geothermal direct use. And this is going to be delivered by Ms. Ellen Halsgrimsdottir. Ms. Halsgrimsdottir is a senior energy specialist at the World Bank ESMAP program, and she's going to be sharing with us this presentation next. So, Ms. Ellen, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you all for inviting me to participate. Do you hear me? Sorry, a little bit.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me at this webinar. My presentation will focus on financing challenges of geothermal project, and I will also give a few examples of financing opportunities, financing of projects. But I would maybe like to start is that geothermal direct use has not received the attention it deserves up until now, but there is a huge potential, as Andy so vividly demonstrated, and the moment is here, as food security and energy independence is high on the agenda. From a project point of view, financing geothermal direct use project depends heavily on where you are in the project preparation stage and the tasks to be performed. To ensure feasibility of the project, decision points should be implemented to safeguard that decisions are based on the best available data at every given point. The early stages, preliminary survey and pre-feasibility survey, and often the feasibility stage, are the most difficult to finance, and the development of geothermal energy has historically significantly depended on financial resources from the public sector, especially for these stages. But public funds are scarce, and what really is the rationale for such support. In theory, public financing for geothermal energy can be argued based on incomplete and imperfect market. Classical economic theory dictates that in situation of complete and perfectly competitive market outcomes are socially optimal. In practice, these conditions are rarely met. There are incomplete and or imperfect market, and market forces alone yield some suboptimal outcome, which can be improved through public intervention. The critical juncture for geothermal development is at the exploration and sometimes at the delineation phase, or the pre-feasibility and feasibility stages, when the resource risks are high and costs start to rise. It is here that the private sector has often been challenged to participate, with a difficulty to hedge risk. However, please note that drilling for geothermal direct use project, especially standalone project, can cost less, and depending on the scale, fewer wells are needed. Thus, pre-feasibility and feasibility stages can often be joined together. After the exploration and often the feasibility stage, the downstream cost increases with construction of the facilities, but here developers have less challenge to attract private financing for development. But there are several other factors, as my previous speakers have also mentioned, that influence the financing and the feasibility of a project. Geothermal project can be designed from the beginning as cogeneration project, electrical generation, or direct use project. This decision will influence the complexity and feasibility of project and often the local acceptance. Most common method for high enthalpy resources has been to start by focusing on electrical generation, and after knowledge of the resource increases with operation, a consideration is often made to enhance the revenue stream and the utilization by adding direct use application. Even though it exists that cogeneration projects start as a direct use project, up until now that has been rare. But with increased focus of stakeholders engagement, there is an interest to plan cogeneration with direct use from the beginning and even start with that part of the project. For standalone direct use project has historically utilized more low to middle temperature resources, and it is an interesting fact that currently the biggest direct use countries have cold climate, so house heating have driven the need to utilize these resources, but that is about to change. Also, as mentioned in the first slide, it has a huge impact on financing of geothermal project if you're adding a new unit or facility to existing plant, or if you have a greenfield project. But it is very difficult to talk about financing without also mentioning the enabling environment. This has already been discussed in other sessions, but due to its importance, I would like to mention it here also in respect to financing. I would like to start with discussing what is needed in order to attract and scale up investment. One of the most important aspects of geothermal development on a country level is to have centralized database to ensure geothermal resource data will not be lost, for example, if developer changes or if they decide not to utilize the resource. And also to ensure proper resource management and sustainable utilization, because sustainability is a very important factor in direct use in geothermal utilization. The government, however, is responsible to have the legal and regulatory framework comprehensive, clear, and as simple as possible. Definition of geothermal direct use resources should include both heat, minerals, and gas utilization. Who owns the resource and which institution are responsible needs to be defined, but also for industrial park, who has the right of the resource and thus who is responsible for the resource management. Government policies to create the enabling environment will need to consider if financial incentives are needed and support mechanisms to scale up utilization. But in every project, the social acceptance is often the most critical aspect and sometimes not considered enough, at least not in the old days. The government has to set the stage with adequate legal, environment, and social laws and regulation, and the developer has to follow them. Additionally, the government can look at including incentive requirement to maximize the social economic benefits for local communities. In order to scale up geothermal development in a given country, and as has also been mentioned before, the government needs to plan and set up strategy. It is therefore important to map current and future demand for heat in agriculture and also other industries. The geothermal potential also needs to be mapped, as well as the available infrastructure at each location. This will give the government an overview of their estimated potential and investment needed to prepare the sites. Furthermore, it is recommended to prepare a preliminary analysis for transportation of goods and what improvements are needed, as well as considering the distance to market. All of these studies will feed into a selection criteria where sites are prioritized with cost-benefit analysis. Finally, a target for the heat generation with geothermal should be set. Some of these studies will overlap with the first stage of preparation of project preparation, but generally they will be more detailed and specific for each site. When government has set target and prioritized sites, a strategy needs to be decided on how to develop the resource in the country. The strategy developed for the utilization of geothermal resources can be different for each site or one for the whole country. The target and the timeline has to be established. The timeline needs to take into consideration changes needed to the infrastructure as well as the forecasted heat demand. It is recommended that at this stage, the socioeconomic benefits are also mapped, which can be created with the project. But one of the most important aspects is to have adequate and preferably best practice of legal, regulatory, and institutional framework. The suitability of current setup can be analyzed with a gap analysis to ensure and demonstrate to future developers. A market sounding to investigate the interest from private sector, this private investor is essential, and last but not least, other aspect of each site selected has to be evaluated. For example, land, off-taker, currency, procurement, and distribution. On this slide, several options for geothermal development strategy are demonstrated. These can apply to both direct use projects as well as cogeneration. All these options have been implemented before, and thus it is not something new. But going through the studies mentioned earlier, some of the risks and challenges have been identified and in many cases reduced. This allows the government to select the best strategy for the country, or as I mentioned before, each site. When selecting the strategy, few questions have to be answered. If the government aims to mobilize private investment, how will private developers be selected and under what high-level risk allocation? What are the roles and responsibilities of public stakeholders? And does the current legal and regulatory framework enable an efficient selection of private developers? How can the socio-economic benefits of geothermal deployment be maximized? As you can see, 3 out of the 4 strategies mentioned here have the government participating in the geothermal project either as a developer or as a part of a cost-sharing mechanisms, at least in the early stages. According to an SMAP analysis from 2016, successful scaling up of geothermal development has benefited from government support. Even though the study focused on electrical generation, the same applies for direct use project. This assistance from the government can take many forms. It can be government-supported mechanism, cost-sharing mechanism, geothermal resource insurance mechanism, or early-stage fiscal incentives and mechanism. To the best of my knowledge, there are currently under implementation or preparation 4 mechanisms that focus on cost-sharing. These are GREM in Indonesia, RSM in Turkey, GRMF in East Africa, and GDF in Latin America. As you can see, the mechanism can also be regional as well as country focus. At least 2 of those facilities also support geothermal direct use early stage development. I would like to demonstrate to you some examples, and I will start with the risk sharing mechanism, the RSM, that is currently under implementation in Turkey. The RSM initial goal is to support the drilling of the first 3 wells, but it is possible to apply also for wells 4 and 5. The risk sharing mechanism offers different risk prime depending on the location, as some areas in Turkey are more developed than others. For a location where the resource is less developed, the risk prime is 60%, but 40% in more developed locations. Also, the prime decreases after the initial 3 wells and is 40% for wells 4 and 5, regardless of location. The developer will pay success fee if the drilling is successful. The first 2 rounds of evaluation was finalized last year, and the facility or the mechanism has currently 19 projects in its portfolio. Out of these 19 projects, there are 4 projects for geothermal direct use standalone and 3 cogeneration projects. Most, if not all, of the direct use projects are considering application in agriculture. So in short, financing is available for direct use, as can be seen around the world. But one of the challenges is the scale of the project, as many of them are quite small in size, but also that it is considered an increased risk if they plan multiple off-takers of the geothermal energy. This is perhaps something we need to look further into as we want to promote geothermal industrial parks. Financing and technical assistance is also available for multiple institutions and development banks, both in terms of loan or concessional loans or grants. However, as I stated before, there are several financing institutions and mechanisms available, but this depends highly on multiple factors. And while resource risk mitigation schemes can be critical for kickstarting and scaling up geothermal development program, they are not substitutes for addressing various other challenges and risks faced by those investing in geothermal in specific countries. These factors that can undermine the investment climate, depending on circumstances of a given country, could include inaccurate policies to support the development of the sector, high upfront cost to develop the steam field and the facility or power plant, the accessibility to market, and also lack of infrastructure required to provide easy access to this area, limited availability of technical expertise, and the overall country risk perceived by investors. I would like to present to you a project that Turkey and the World Bank have recently approved for enhancing use of geothermal heat in agriculture. The project is a $300 million project with multiple components. One component of the project is a $30 million dedicated for drilling and providing infrastructure for estimated 180 hectares of greenhouses. This project is expected to become effective later this year, and the geothermal component of the project is estimated to leverage $100 million in private financing. The project is also expected to benefit women in the vicinity of the projects, as in 2020, women accounted for 40% of the workforce in agriculture industry in Turkey. I would also like to mention that on top of this agricultural project and the risk-sharing mechanism in Turkey, a project providing financing for geothermal development was approved last year and has become effective. This project includes $300 million financing, but it has the restriction that minimum 10% or $30 million is earmarked for geothermal direct use project. This project lends financing to private sector for construction of the facilities and the power plants. In addition, developers can also apply for grants to finalize the preparation of their documents to demonstrate bankability. In summary, there exists both commercial and other financing for geothermal direct use project. Enabling an environment and scale of the project will play a crucial role if private financing is to be mobilized. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Ellen, for that wonderful presentation. I mean, it's always interesting to hear about announcing of projects, because we know this is a major bottleneck for moving the projects forward. And this case study that you've shared, the Turkey's case study, I think this is quite interesting because it also contains an aspect of agri-food, so using geothermal in the agri-food sector, and also the objective that it aims to leverage about $100 million from the private sector to support further geothermal development. So I think this is a very, very interesting case study that other regions and other countries that are looking into geothermal direct use can be able to learn from. And happy that you are here to share this with us and with all our participants. So thank you very much. So we are going to the next presentation. And for this, once again, I'm going to call upon Hezi to make a presentation. And this one is going to be about how to address the knowledge gaps which are hindering the accelerated deployment of geothermal energy in the agri-food sector. So Hezi, over to you.
Thank you, Jack. that's going to be my last one today. And this presentation was prepared, as I said before, by Anna Colvin, who could not make the presentation itself. So all credit goes to her. It's very clear that not that many people know about geothermal, not that many people know about geothermal direct use, not that many people know about the geothermal direct use in the agri-food sector. And I think this gap is growing as you go more into the developing countries, where communication is less fluent on those subjects. So what do we do? What do we do in order to address the knowledge gap, in order to make sure that more people know about the opportunities and more people will commit to develop this sector, the agri-food sector, using geothermal resource? As you can see in the slide again in front of you, we're looking at like 5 pillars. We're talking about awareness creation, capacity building. Awareness creation is basically to make more people knowledgeable about the situation. Capacity building means that we need to bring in the people that can do the work. And then we have innovation, sustainability, and finally the socioeconomic impacts. I'm going to talk about each element in the following slide. So we can move to the next one in the interest of time. Alex. So awareness creation is to demonstrate the benefit of the opportunities of agri-food application for policymakers, entrepreneurs, and communities. What we need to do is to raise awareness at the local level, given the geothermal heat, unlike electricity, is used locally. We need to build capacity also through academia or technical capacity building programs for geoscientists, as we mentioned before, that include the geochemist or geophysicist, the reservoir engineer, and geologist, of course. And then we need to bring in the drilling engineer, project managers, environmental, social experts, policymakers, and finally the financing people. Pilot projects are very, very important because they can demonstrate not only to the local community, but also to other communities, other districts, the benefit of developing a geothermal project and supporting the agri-food value chain in this area. So there should be a lot of emphasis done on pilot project, because a successful pilot project will entail additional commercially viable projects. And partnership is also a very important element to focus on. Fortunately, we have quite a few institutions and other places where you can rely on technical support in one shape or form. We will talk about that in more details in different slide. Next, Alex. For instance, you see that you have a lot of those supporting partners, potential supporting partners. These are all over the place. You have places, you have a geothermal center of excellence, which was developed by GDC in Kenya, for instance, and they provide training courses. And you have a similar institute in Chile. You have similar institute in Mexico, in US and other places, Europe, US, and South America. I won't go into the details which one of them can do, because again, I think we're running short of time. But I would like to suggest that you can see a variety of services you can get there. You can get training, you can do research, you can get consulting help, and you can also send people to get educated, either in Iceland or in El Salvador, in the geothermal space, and with the emphasis on direct use. Next, Alex. So here are two examples of programs that can help in Central America. In 2016, Germany's GES, I want to try to pronounce what it stands for, established a regional program in Central America to promote and advance the use of geothermal heat in 6 countries: Central America, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. GES implemented the program on behalf of the federal government in cooperation with counterpart, the what is called SICA. The program also has international partnership with the World Bank and the German BVG, as well as with the IGA, whose president we saw before. The first phase of the project, the promotion of geothermal energy in Central America, was called for GEO1 and was implemented between 2015 and 2020. The objective of the program was to support capacity building and development of an enabling environment for investment to facilitate the implementation of agricultural industrial application of geothermal energy. As part of the project, the technical, commercial, social feasibility of select pilot projects were assessed for cascading and standalone projects, as I explained before. And those pilot projects took place in El Salvador, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Honduras. The second phase of the project, which is the other side, the second part of the slide, the geothermal heat utilization for industrial processes in SICA member countries. This would be in South America, Central South America. Started in 2020 and will last until 2023, so we're in the middle of it. This phase of program focuses on implementing pilot projects through policy dialogue, adaptation of regulatory framework, knowledge dissemination, capacity building, stakeholder collaboration, and project development. Not only will this pilot project demonstrate the potential to lower energy consumption costs for the agriculture food, but they are also intended to have social and economic impact in terms of job creation and sustainable local community development, all the important things that we discussed before. And leveraging the establishment of geothermal eco-industrial park, which is a very interesting tool, offers a model for utilizing geothermal resources, so innovating practices, to generate further revenue streams and reduce waste. These parks attract multiple geothermal direct use businesses, which serve as the incubation center for innovation in the energy food nexus. Using application in cascade and developing new innovation technology is one way that geothermal is driving sustainability. If you look at this example, you see that on the left side, we have a project in Sweden that it's based on a coal-fired power plant, which is really the nemesis of the renewable energy sector. But anyway, we have a symbiosis here, whereby this power plant also has a direct use application, which they work together. In the middle, we have the one in Iceland, the combined heat and power plant, which operate the Blue Lagoon, the famous spa next to the Iceland airport. It is really a dermatology clinic that integrates the use of a geothermal mineral, a biotech unit for algae production, also methanol manufacturing facility that uses CO2 from the geothermal resource as a raw material. And lastly, we have the GeoFood project in the Netherlands, which is a combination of, which is supported by several countries in order to demonstrate the circular production. On the socioeconomic impact, next one, please. The socioeconomic impact is also a very important part of our discussion. Performing those socioeconomic impact analysis can help investors, policymakers, and society evaluate the benefit to incorporating geothermal energy into the agri-food business. As some of the speakers discussed it before, some of the benefits for doing what we do, which is using geothermal in the agri-food value chain, is not reflected in dollars and cents, but is reflected with other parameters which should be taken into account because they are very valuable. We can do a cost-benefit analysis, which determines net impact of monetized and non-monetized socioeconomic indicators of benefits and cost of implementing the geothermal direct use project in the agri-food sector. Business seeks to incorporate sustainability in their operation as business seeks to incorporate business sustainability in their operation. This methodology can be used to measure the non-financing related metrics such as social environmental aspects. Job creation is a good example. So it provides the decision makers with a semi-quantitative approach to incorporate socioeconomic factors into the business cases. So not only dollar cents, but also the impact on the society. And finally, we go to the recommendations. Several measures can be taken to address the challenge of building capacity of the local skilled geothermal workforce, education and awareness. Remember, we're talking about closing the gap, the knowledge gap. Suggestion: partner within the national, regional, or local institution to provide training and certification programs for the downstream workforce to develop, operate, and maintain direct use projects. Raise awareness on the benefit and feasibility of direct use project among policymakers, communities, and private sector agri-food industries. Identify best practices and promote exchange of experience and knowledge among countries and training centers at regional level. Build the capacity of public institutions to identify direct use opportunity and assess their financial as well as their social economic viability. And with that, I'm done for this presentation. And again, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Hezi, and thank you to all our presenters for taking your time to share your knowledge with us. So we have one more presenter, but unfortunately he's not able to join us today. So I think right now we'll come to the end of the presentations. And if we have any questions from the participants, then I think we can take about 2 questions, if there are any. But in the meantime, maybe I can pose a question to Olivier. And this is regarding your work at FAO. And I'm just wondering, how has the uptake of renewables in the agri-food sector been, based on your experience? And who are some of the stakeholders who are supporting farmers and other people to integrate renewables in their agricultural practices? Sorry, Olivier, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I was muting. Can you come again with your question?
Yeah, I was wondering, based on your experience with the work that you're doing with the FAO, how do you see the uptake of renewables in the agri-food sector, and who are some of the stakeholders who are supporting countries to integrate renewables in the agri-food sector?
It depends, I guess. I guess large companies, maybe the uptake is larger, but usually the large companies they take up renewable energy for their own functioning, for their own energy needs. They don't go to the step 3, stage 3 along the value chain. So they don't maybe do the work also along the value chains with farmers and so on. So that's for large companies. But what I see missing is what I was mentioning, is that you don't have enough information about the feasibility, basically, of these investments. And so from our work, what we noted is, if you look purely at a financial point of view, for the investors, it's not easy, because the investment in renewable energy for food chains is usually relatively high, especially if you have small users, small scale users, and they are scattered. And so, but if you look at the non-financial benefits, like, a biogas byproduct, biofertilizer, biochar improving land, the better income, more income for farmers because they reduce their food losses. They have better quality products. If you look at some health benefits, if you look at some other aspects beyond, and the job creation, for example, local job creation, which go beyond the purely financial aspect. It's more about the local economy, and then most of the time it is profitable from an economic point of view, not necessarily financial point of view. And this is where public-private partnership become key, because the public sector should say, well, because from a national or local economy, it makes sense, it brings benefits, then we can have policies and regulations that support the investors, such as, you know, soft loans, premiums to agri-food actors for their products if they use renewable energy, that kind of support. And that's one thing. One thing that we also notice is that if you go to the banks, they usually have quite high interest rates. And if you come up with something new, which is not in their books, they may be reluctant to fund it. So you need to find other solutions. And I know that some financial companies do that, you know, to avoid that, for example, you know, the farmer has to give his land as a collateral. So you have systems where you pay for the service, you don't pay for the system, the renewable energy system itself. Sometimes the renewable energy companies, they also add to their package support to the energy appliances. So they contact the agri-food chain actors and they say, well, we can sell you the energy system, but also we can help you concerning the energy appliance with a good deal, for example. So there are all sorts of things that happen, but it's not always easy, I must say. But we, at our end, what we do is we provide this first stage of information to de-risk investments, best location, cost-benefit analysis, and then with that, the financing organizations can go and do their more detailed financial analysis and propose financial tools. But the uptake, it's a bit frustrating because we provide this information to the governments, but we are not really in a position to follow up if there's really been an uptake, which is a bit frustrating. Maybe yes, maybe not, but we noted that sometimes it blocks because the local banking system is not ready for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very in-depth response. I don't see more questions. I think I'll just ask one last one to Andy Blair. And we cannot let you go without responding to one of these. So, I mean, it's very interesting listening to your presentation and how the local communities have been part of the geothermal development in New Zealand. And of course, this makes for a very beautiful story to tell about the human side of geothermal. And just wondering what has made it easy for New Zealand to be able to bring the local communities into geothermal development, both for electricity and direct uses?
I think, firstly, thanks for the question, Jack, because it's really dear to our hearts in New Zealand, and we understand that Indigenous and local communities are important to the success of geothermal projects. Geothermal projects are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years old and more, and so we will exist for a long time in places, and so we have to be good neighbours. And in New Zealand, Māori, our Indigenous people, have constitutional rights that exist, so they are recognised as landowners and have rights as everybody else. And the geothermal law, accessing geothermal in New Zealand, it's considered a water take, So you ask for a volume of water from a regional council group, but to actually get on the land, you have to have permission from the landowner. And so what that does is it creates a position where Indigenous groups and landowners can negotiate equity in other stakes and projects. So what it does is it gives some power and leverage back to the landowners. And, you know, that's been a powerful tool to create great ongoing relationships with Indigenous communities in New Zealand. And so regulators and policy play a huge role in supporting that activity. I think seeing the other side of that and the results of really strong relationships between the communities and developers, and the communities actually becoming developers and owning projects. We've seen such an amazing transformation of groups and activities, and I think it's, you know, I'd love to see more of it out in the world. At COP, we talked about, you know, not leaving people behind, and how climate change is not an environmental crisis, it's a human crisis. The planet's going to live without us. We just need somewhere for us humans to live, and we can't leave people behind in that clause. And so making sure that people are at the top of our economic analysis of investment and return is really important. And so more of these projects and engagement with communities, I think, is really relevant to the challenges that we face. And we look to governments and others and developers to see that as a true sustainable and a successful project means that communities are part of them in a meaningful way. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you very much, Andy. Yeah, so I think it's very important. One of the things I've taken from that is that we need not to leave people behind, so that we all go together forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your participation in this event. And now I would like to give a special thanks to our wonderful speakers for all the presentations, and to all the participants for your patience and also active participation in the chat. And of course, to our co-hosts, the IGA and the FAO, for your support and your contribution during the organization and also during the proceedings of this event. So as it was mentioned by my director, Mr. Gurgus Golu, in his opening remarks, we are going to continue to the next phase of this project, where we'll be focusing on capacity building, as well as dissemination of the results of the guidebook for policymakers on the use of geothermal in the agri-food sector. And we are going to be taking a regional approach in that. So our next capacity building event will be focusing on East Africa, and this will be on the 19th of July. And we are going to be sharing more details about this event in the coming weeks. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, and I wish you a good day ahead. And for Andy with New Zealand, wish you a lovely night. So thank you very much.